Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Your Spiritual Journey. This is Dr. Bob, and this is the space and the place where we talk about things important to your soul. From the very beginning of this podcast, one of our goals has been to promote interfaith understanding. And it's something, if you've been a fan of this podcast, you know that that's something that's been ongoing, as we have guests representing very different points of view on spirituality, many coming from places that you may not think even existed. But what we find is that everybody's headed to the same place. I met today's guest at an interfaith meeting with the Turkish Cultural Center, and I was focused on that in my mind until I realized I knew her before that because we worked on a racial wealth gap simulation together. I say together, she was the trainer, I was the trainee, and then I became a trainer after that. So I find that the diversity of roles that she plays in interfaith cooperation and dialogue has intrigued me for a couple years. And that's why I've spent 2 years trying to get her on the program. But she's here today, and I am so excited to have her with us today. I'm also curious to find out how a New Hampshire-raised woman who started out as a 6th grade teacher in North Carolina became a guiding force in the Pittsburgh theological scene. So we're in for a real treat today. Liddy Barlow, that is Reverend Liddy Barlow, became the first woman to be installed as Executive Minister of Christian Associates of Southwest Pennsylvania. She reports to the Council of Bishops and Judicatory.
It's one of those really weird words that no one says except people who have my job.
Judicatory executives who represent 28 Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox church bodies throughout Greater Pittsburgh. As executive minister, Reverend Barlow sets a vision for Christian Associates and manages all of the organization's projects and relationships, which is why it's taken me 2 years to get her on the program. Just to give an example, in the aftermath of the anti-Semitic massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue on October 27, 2018, Reverend Barlow offered a clear voice of compassion and hope, representing the Christian community at numerous interfaith and civic events. With partners of many faith traditions, notably the Center for Loving Kindness and Civic Engagement at the Jewish Community Center, she convened interfaith spiritual leaders from 9 world religions and 24 Christian denominations for the We Have to Talk initiative, which continues to promote collegiality and healing. She's also the winner of many awards, and now I'm going to give her a blush. On June 24, 2019, Reverend Barlow received an Antoinette Brown Award for trailblazing leadership in the United Church of Christ. She was recognized as 40 Under 40 leader by Pittsburgh Magazine. She received a Circle of Courage Award from BCC Ministries, a Dialogue Award from the Turkish Cultural Center, and the Volunteer Mitzvah Award from the Jewish Community Center of Greater Pittsburgh. The Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh recognized her as one of the righteous among the neighbors. I could go on, but I think I'll let her do that and pick up the mic from here. Liddy, as you know, we ask you to start with your childhood and relate your spiritual journey that got you to where you are right now, and then I'll ask you some questions.
Oh, this is great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bob, for having me. This is, and I'll even forgive you for like listing off all kinds of embarrassing awards. I love this endeavor. I love the curiosity that is behind this project. And I love the name of this project. I love your spiritual journey, because I think that all of us are on a spiritual journey. And for me, some of the most interesting and engaging and meaningful parts of my spiritual journey have been when that inner journey gets mirrored by an outer journey. I love the practice of pilgrimage. I love the ways that travel as a spiritual practice kind of engages our whole bodies in this pursuit of what is holy and what is meaningful and what is real. So yes, hooray for spiritual journees. And thanks for having me on the show. So I was looking at some of your past podcasts, and I realized immediately that there's not with all of your guests, but with many of your guests, there's a little bit of a difference between their spiritual path and mine, because my spiritual path has been in this institutional, traditional, religious place. Whereas a lot of the folks who you have on this program are seekers who are going in lots of untraditional directions. And for me, that's simply where the story of my faith has found its home. I think that spirituality is about what is the big story that you want your life to tell. And there are lots of these stories out there. I think the great world religious traditions, as well as all those sort of new religious traditions, they're all simply different stories. And for me, I'm lucky in that the story in which I was raised has turned out to be a story that I want to tell with my life also. So I grew up in the tradition in which I now serve as an authorized minister. I grew up in the United Church of Christ. For those who might not know, the United Church of Christ is a Reformed Protestant part of the Christian family tree. I sometimes call us the church that the pilgrims from the first Thanksgiving grew up to become eventually. But the pilgrim story is not the only part of the UCC. We're also what's called a united and uniting church. So we are a church body that has intentionally been the product of merger of other churches, because we see the unity of the church as something that's worth striving toward. This is something that Jesus talks about a lot in the Gospels. It's something that Paul emphasizes in the New Testament, is this sense that all of Christ's followers are one. And we as a denomination have chosen to make that part of our institutional unity also, to form this united denomination. My own United Church of Christ background looked like your stereotypical New England white steepled church on the town green, small town New England life. That was my context growing up. I was a very sort of regular churchgoer. I participated in Sunday school and vacation Bible school throughout my childhood. I have to say I was not particularly taken with it, though. Like, it was part of my life, but it was not something that I was ever like really, really excited about. I associated church with wearing really scratchy white tights, and then at the end of church, we would all race down to the church basement where they would have like donut holes on the right. Like the coffee hour table. So like that was the real excitement, was like that race to the donut holes. I kind of saw church as an extracurricular activity. You know, it was kind of like ballet lessons or piano lessons. You know, it was just like one more thing that you went to. And I'm really fortunate because the particular congregation that my family belonged to was one where your experience of church only deepened as you went through confirmation class and into high school. In a lot of churches, confirmation class can sometimes be like a graduation from church. Like, congratulations, you made it through Sunday school, now you never have to come back. But my home church actually did a really good job of deepening that experience, and I am so grateful for that, because what I experienced as a teenager in my home congregation has really formed the rest of my life and my ministry and my spirituality. So a couple things I would point to. First, I would say that our high school youth group was a place where the usual boundaries of high school social relationships were blurred or shifted or erased. And I found that very interesting. I was kind of I was pretty much a big nerd in high school. I don't think that's going to surprise anybody who knows me now, right? So I was sort of the goody two-shoes, never gets in trouble, gets straight A's kid, but not like super popular. And then there were other kids who were sort of like more socially adept than me. And then there were other kids who were like not particularly good at school. Like they were, in the sort of vocational track. What was amazing is when we would get together as a youth group, and especially when we would participate in service together, all of a sudden it's those kids who are in the shop classes. They're the ones who know much more than me about the projects that we're working on. Those popular kids who I don't have a lot of contact with in my regular school life, all of a sudden we're brought together into this space and we're talking about big things and things that are real. Like I remember some conversations about, times when people had experienced some, significant like losses or traumas in their lives, and church became a place where we could have those conversations. So that was really fascinating to me. Church was also a place where we did service, and particularly I remember a real turning point in my own faith journey was when I was 14 years old. I went to Washington, D.C. with my church youth group, and we spent a week volunteering in soup kitchens and homeless shelters. One of the sort of classic mission trip model. It's a little bit out of vogue these days. I think we recognize there's some problematic pieces with that, 1 week mission trip model. But I'm grateful to it because it changed my life. And it did because the first day, before we went to any of the sites, the woman who was organizing this week for us spoke to our group, and she said, you guys are from a small town. She didn't use the word privileged, but I think we would today describe it as a privileged town. You probably don't see a lot of homeless people in your regular life. And she was like, but you will here in Washington, D.C. This was the mid-90s. Homelessness was a real crisis at that point. You're going to see a lot of homeless people. And you don't have to give them money when they ask you for money, but you have to this week promise me you're going to look every one of those people in the eye and speak to them because that person is a child of God. Now, I had heard this phrase, child of God, in Sunday school and had sung it in the little cherub choir and these sorts of things, but it had never been as real to me. And then discovering Matthew 25 and that description that when you see a person who's in need, it's not just that person is your sort of brother or sister, but that person is in some real and mystic way actually Christ himself. And that recognition, that way of seeing other people was enormously, enormously powerful for me. Yeah. So that's kind of my high school experience left me seeing church as a place where important things could happen, where you could be of service, not just out of a kind of service is nice, we're in the Rotary kind of way, but in a, no offense to the Rotary, I know, sorry, I said that, careful. I was like, whoa, but I think there is a difference between a secular service and a service that's driven by a kind of faith commitment, So church is a place where service can happen, church is a place where relationships can happen, and church is a place where the really big ideas, the really meaningful questions can get raised. So grateful that was the kind of church that I found myself in. Mm-hmm. I went to college after that. I went to Mount Holyoke College in Western Massachusetts. I was enormously fortunate that at the time, Mount Holyoke had a very, very vibrant interfaith religious life on campus. Mount Holyoke had a dynamic, mainline, progressive Protestant campus ministry, which is a unicorn, and I am so, so blessed to have had that experience as a college student, to have had really interesting religious worship and fellowship opportunities for mainline Protestant students on my campus, and opportunities to take leadership in that community, where I had the model of an ordained woman in leadership in that way. That was the first woman minister that I had known, and I think that her example was really formative for me. And also where I started to have interfaith encounters. My hometown in New Hampshire did have a synagogue, so I had Jewish friends and had sort of been aware of some of the basic outlines of Judaism. But Mount Holyoke was a place where I was meeting students from a very wide range of religious traditions, and where every Tuesday we would have an interfaith prayer lunch on campus. And so on Tuesday, instead of going to the dining hall, you would go to the Office of Religious Life in the big lounge. The different faith groups would take turns making soup and then leading a program about their religious tradition. Maybe it was about a holiday they were about to celebrate, or maybe it was common misconceptions that they wanted to correct, or maybe it was a speaker they brought in. And so we cultivated this sense of commonality across these religious traditions, and also the fascinating differences between our traditions. All these traditions are not the same. They're not necessarily asking the same questions. They don't necessarily come from the same place. And yet they can be asking these questions in this communal setting, of one that is about supportive relationship, one that's about mutual affirmation. So that was really important. My senior year of college, the attacks of 9/11 happened on the first Tuesday of my senior year of college. And that was where we all went, was to Elliott House, to the Office of Religious Life. We just didn't hardly need an invitation. We just convened there and sat there and cried together and took care of each other in that space. So, very formative thing. My senior year of college, also, my mother died unexpectedly. She was very young, younger every year, right? So my mom was 46 when she died unexpectedly from some complications of some medicine she was taking. And this was really the first bad thing that had ever happened to me. I had experienced the very sad loss of my grandfather, but you expect your grandfather to die. Yeah. You don't expect to lose your mom, not so soon. And my family was surrounded by the church in those hard weeks, that there were between my church where I grew up and the church that my grandmother attended, we were very close to her pastor, and then my college chapel, and then my father was actually Roman Catholic, so his whole sort of family, we had so many churches surrounding us with care and so many religious leaders of different traditions praying for us. We started actually to keep a list, just because we were we're winning this tally of how many faith traditions could be praying simultaneously. That was an aspect of the work of religious service that I hadn't experienced before, and to be able to witness what it looked like to be actively cared for, I think also shaped my interest in pursuing ministry as a vocation.
Okay, you just threw me for a loop. Your father was Roman Catholic.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of buried the lead there.
Where did that come from?
Yeah, so my parents were a first in their family marriage of a Protestant and a Catholic. My dad is from a family that's a working class Italian Slovenian family in suburban Hartford, Connecticut. My mom was from an upper middle class family that was a Norwegian English family. They had previously been Lutheran and Methodist. It was a little scandalous, honestly. Even the marriage of the Lutheran and the Methodist was kind of scandalous at the time. When my grandparents moved to New England for my grandfather's job, they joined a United Church of Christ congregation. And so my parents also had this ecumenical marriage. In order to get married in the church in the late 1970s, I think this is still true, to have a priest officiate at that wedding, they had to agree that their children would be raised Catholic.
Right.
That clearly did not happen. They had hoped to do so. That intention didn't last particularly long. The story goes that my parents were meeting with the priest about my baptism. And the priest asked them who the godparents would be, and they named this, wonderful couple. They're very close friends. And the priest asked where they went to church, and my parents said that they went to the First Congregational Church. And the priest, who, could have just said something like, "Oh, I'm sure those are really great people. Maybe they can, we'd be glad to recognize them on the day, but your godparents need to be Catholic. It's right. Like canon law." Instead, the priest was really rude to them, and the story goes that my father stood up and said, we promised we would do everything within our power to raise our daughter as a Catholic, and you're asking me to do something that is not within my power. And my parents walked out and had me baptized down the street at the UCC church. I don't know if that story is accurate, but that is how it came to me.
Yeah. Sounds dramatic.
Yes, yeah. I think, it's interesting because I love the United Church of Christ. I serve, in addition to, my professional role at Christian Associates, I also have a lot of volunteer leadership roles in my denominational body. I serve the assistant moderator of the Penn West Conference and so forth. And I love the UCC, and I do actually think that if I had been raised Catholic, I think I would have been a pretty good Catholic too. I think I just like us to latch myself onto a good story,
Oh,
I think I just like a community of faith to believe and think together, and we'll see.
But there's this thing of very strict dogmatic faith, and then there's this more liberal ecumenical faith that's going on.
So here's the thing is, I think that, so first of all, I think there's room in the United Church of Christ for a wide range of places. But we are ultimately a church that, while we don't hold anyone to affirmation of a particular creed or statement of faith, we are a denomination that honors the historic creeds of the church. And I know in my certainly in my role at Christian Associates, I work with a lot of churches that have a very sort of stricter emphasis on religious orthodoxy, and I think those people are often surprised to discover that my own Christianity is pretty darn orthodox. I don't feel like I'm way outside the orthodox consensus of the church on pretty much any issue. There's the small issue of the fact that I'm a woman wearing a clerical collar. And that's a significant difference between the United Church of Christ and the Roman Catholic Church or many other churches, and a discrepancy between many, many centuries of Christian history. I recognize there have not been women authorized within church history for all these centuries. Yeah, I think sometimes it can be hard to reconcile that. Yeah. But I know that I have seen the Spirit alive and at work in the ministry of ordained women. And I hope to carry that in my own ministry as well. And we'll let God sort it all out.
Okay. Well, my church, Waverly, and we have a long history of women ministers at our church.
Yeah, and there's a long history of women's ministry in the church, including in the very earliest church.
Oh yeah, if you go back to the Nag Hammadi.
Sure, and I think the New Testament is full of women leaders, and we've lost this to some degree over time, in terms of ordained leadership, but we never lost the leadership of women in the church. Some of my heroes are, these incredible women monastic leaders of the Middle Ages. Someone like St. Hilda, for example, who is an incredible woman with administrative gifts, who was using those administrative gifts in the service of the church. And so there's always been women's leadership. It's just a question of, whether those women were allowed to handle sacramental mysteries, right? And I feel like, there's something in presiding at the sacraments that I think is such a beautiful privilege, and I try to do that carefully and well.
Is there a little more to the story before
so I guess I think the rest of it kind of flows from there. I think the pieces that I named sort of set up much of the course that I've been following since that point. So there's, thus by the time I was finishing college, it was pretty clear to me that I wanted to pursue ordained ministry. I even tried that on a little bit as a visiting student at the University of Edinburgh. I took classes one semester during my study abroad experience in their divinity school, just as maybe if I take these classes, I can get this weird idea about seminary out of my system. And then I took the classes and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. This is the stuff I want to study. I guess I have to do this. So I knew I wanted to pursue ordained ministry. I also felt at 22 that it would be good to go do something in the real world first. So I went and taught sixth grade, as you mentioned, with the Teach for America program in Rocky Mount, North Carolina for 2 years. And then I applied to every seminary I could think of and found myself at Andover Newton Theological School, which at the time was in Boston and has since moved in to become a school of Yale. I did seminary. I came to Pittsburgh. I got married. I had babies. I served churches.
Okay, just a minute now.
Yeah.
When you finished seminary, why did you come to Pittsburgh?
Yeah, so I actually came to Pittsburgh because my husband, who I had met in North Carolina, was doing his PhD here at Carnegie Mellon. So,
Okay.
so it's and it was a funny experience because I knew I wanted to marry Greg. I knew not only that I wanted to marry Greg, I knew that I felt called to marry Greg, and I knew I felt called to ministry in the United Church of Christ. And on paper, those things looked like you couldn't reconcile them because there's not very many United Church of Christ congregations in Western Pennsylvania, not within shouting distance of Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
There's like 5 churches that have a full-time
Right.
pastor. And I had been on a pilgrimage that spring semester of my final year of seminary. And I was in a little tiny town in the British county of Dorset called Whitchurch Canonicorum. And
Wow, don't ask me to say that.
so I'm in Whitchurch Canonicorum, and there are these 2 women Anglican priests who have started a retreat center in this town. And they were telling me the story of how they had founded this retreat center. They had been they had been themselves traveling in Spain, and they had been to this famous cave of the Black Madonna on the coast in Spain. And they were in that chapel, and they felt like they heard the statue of the Black Madonna speaking and saying, "Ask for what you want." So they went back to their diocesan bishop and said, "We want to start this retreat center." And lo and behold, it happened. So I had heard this story, and then a few months later was sitting in my dorm room in Boston thinking about, what the heck am I going to do with myself in Pittsburgh? Like, there's no church for me to serve. Like, I don't know. Like, I've been in seminary for 3 years. I have no other marketable skills. What am I going to do with my life? And I remembered that story, and I was like, ask for what you want. So I felt a little silly. I stood there in my dorm room, and I said out loud, I would like an ordainable call, right? I would like a place to serve that the United Church of Christ will sort of recognize for authorized ministry. And the next day, I got an email from the pastor of Smithfield United Church of Christ in downtown Pittsburgh asking if I had any interest in serving in a new position they were creating, the Minister of Christian Education. So it works. Ask for what you want.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's just so true.
Yeah. Came to Pittsburgh. I served 2 local congregations, Smithfield doing Christian education for a couple of years, and then a few years out in ex-urban Pittsburgh, just over the Westmoreland County line, as the solo interim pastor of St. John's United Church of Christ in Larmer in North Huntington Township. And then around the Christmas time of 2013, I had heard that this position at Christian Associates was open, and my role at St. John's was as an interim, and it was sort of starting to come to a close. And I thought, well, here's a job. Like, here's it's like a full-time job that's, relatively rare duck. It's office is 10 minutes from my house. Maybe I should apply for this job. And then I looked at it and I was like, I could never be qualified for that job. Here's the list of qualifications they want. They want somebody who's, been in ministry for 10 years. They want somebody who has all these X, Y, and Z skills. And I'm so glad that one of the most influential things I've ever read was not a book, but it was actually a book review. I have never read the book, but I read a review of Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, her sort of famous book about how, she came to work at Facebook and her advice for women. And one of the statistics that Sheryl Sandberg included in that book that then got echoed in this book review that I read was that men apply for jobs when they meet 60% of the listed criteria on the want ad, and women apply for jobs when they meet 95% of the criteria.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, I meet 60% of these criteria. Maybe I should just go ahead and apply. So I applied, and lo and behold, almost 11 years later, here I am.
Yeah.
It's been amazing. It's been really, really good work.
That's a great story.
Yeah. I love a lot of things about my ministry at Christian Associates. I love that it pulls me out of that place where I think many of us can be prone to, of thinking that the particular way that I do faith and religion, the particular theological commitments that I have, that those are the only or somehow the best way to do religion and spirituality. I love being pushed to interrogate that a little bit more deeply, and to appreciate all that is beautiful in so many other traditions. So that has been really, really rich for me. Sometimes having very, very powerful experiences of worship, for example, with churches that I know I don't agree with on a variety of very important issues, but still sort of like palpably feeling the power of the Spirit in worship experiences. Building real, genuine friendships with people of other faith traditions. Some of my best friends and colleagues are my Jewish friends and colleagues who I just have learned so much from, and have just entered into that real kind of spiritual kinship that is a beautiful thing. And the ways of that this role has also made me really appreciate my home tradition, and appreciate the time that I spend with others of my home tradition as sort of that kind of that home base that you go back to in a game of tag, right? Like here's my people where I can feel sort of really nourished and safe, and then be sent out to work with all kinds of other people in the world.
Yeah. Well, it's obvious in your work, the few times you and I have been at the same event or doing similar things, that you really do enjoy your work, and that you love what you do. And, as the saying goes, if you love what you do, it's not really work.
Yeah, it's funny. Like when there is something that's like, annoying or sticky or tedious, I sometimes find myself like having to remind myself, like, that is why they call this work, because so much of the time my work is a tremendous sense of joy. The Christian theologian Frederick Buechner has a beautiful definition of vocation. What does it mean to be called? And he says famously that the place where you are called is where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Right. And I have found this role at Christian Associates to be that place for me where I can sort of be the person that God made me to be. The second century Saint Irenaeus famously said that the glory of God is a person fully alive. And I feel like I can be fully alive in this role. And also that part about the world's deep hunger, like this is the place where I can actually serve the world best. That there's so many different ways to serve a broken world, and I'm really glad that we're all called in different ways to do that. And this particular sort of strange, bizarre job that I have is actually the best way that I can be serving the world.
Yeah. It's when you get a call, you got to answer. It's it's just really fulfilling your purpose for being here.
Yeah. I'm grateful. I'm really grateful that this is the shape that my life has taken to this point.
Yeah.
It feels worthwhile.
So I have perused your Facebook page.
That's a dangerous game.
And there's a homily on there from 2023 that you gave, and I'm not sure if you changed the names, but the wedding of Phil and Bill.
Those are, in fact, their names. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And it just about brought me to tears. I just loved it. But I'm pretty sure not everyone would have enjoyed it as much as I did. And I wonder if you've had what kind of feedback you've gotten from that posting.
Yeah. So I am of exactly the right generational moment to spend a great deal of time on Facebook, right? Like I'm sort of that. I feel like I'm in some ways sort of the youngest of the sort of Facebook big users. I use Facebook to scrapbook about my kids. I use Facebook to remind people about professional events that I hope they'll show up with. The whole gamut of things. A lot of the stuff on my Facebook page is, sort of friends only. So you're probably you missed all kinds of like beautiful pictures from my trip to Italy. I made that. I will occasionally post a sermon or a homily. I don't post all of them. Not all of them were worth posting, right? Like I feel like I'm a reasonably good preacher, but like even reasonably good preachers create a lot of verbiage that does not need to be shared super widely. Sometimes I feel like I hit on something really good. I really love writing. I love words, and I love the genre of writing sermons. It's a very interesting sort of genre, kind of like writing a sonnet. Like you're sort of fitting. It has to fit into the form, and I find the form itself really, really interesting. So every once in a while, I'll write something and I'll be like, this is actually, maybe I'll share this. Like I feel pleased with this one. And even then, I don't usually make them public until someone asks me, right? Can I share this? And then I'm like, and sometimes I do a little calculation, right? Because I'm aware too that people are going to look at Facebook. That random people are going to Google me, and I don't know what they're Googling me about, right? And that's one of the things that's going to show up. Yeah. I didn't hesitate, and in part, I didn't hesitate to share that because I am really fortunate enough to work in an organization that recognizes that even as I'm responsible for this wide diversity of Christian churches, theologies, practices, that I also am of a tradition, specifically myself, right? Like I am a United Church of Christ pastor, and I'm unapologetic about having that as my sort of home identity, just as I hope the other bishops and executives and church leaders around my table can unapologetically be in their own places and be of themselves. We're not trying to dilute everyone down to some kind of namby-pamby least common denominator Christianity any more than in interfaith spaces we're creating some kind of new interfaith mush. We want people to be authentically of their tradition, and I feel that in presiding with enormous joy at the wedding of these two enormously faithful men, that I was acting really solidly in my tradition, and I felt kind of proud of the words I put together for it, and was happy to share them.
Well, I'm so glad you did. I mean, they're great words.
Yeah. For any listeners, the sermon is about, I don't remember all my sermons, but I do remember this one, just I feel like maybe that means it was okay. The sermon was about the wedding of Cana, which is a pretty common sermon text. Yeah. And I preached it as Jesus' coming out story. It was pretty fun.
It was. And it still is. Anyway, if you get an opportunity, get on Reverend Liddy Barlow's Facebook page. Okay, so here you are in this great space, and I'm a little curious since I was introduced to you through the racial gap simulation. One, how that came about, how you got connected to that, why you felt it was important to spread that, and what's the state of that right now? Is that still happening?
Sure.
What's going on?
Yeah, so the racial wealth gap simulation is a tool that was developed by Bread for the World, which is a Christian anti-hunger advocacy organization, and Network, which is the national body that convenes Roman Catholic women religious for activism, and it's a tool that walks people through the impact that a whole series of federal policies since Reconstruction have had on the wealth gap between white and Black Americans. It's a pretty eye-opening experience. I mean, I know the first time I did it, I think even if you already know a little bit about these policies, right? If you've heard of some of the different ways that that housing redlining happened, or the different disparities in how the GI Bill was used. There's something very powerful about actually getting that literally on the table in front of you, right? Having these little cards that represent money and land and opportunities to see how the people who are drawing those cards as white participants looks really different from the very, very much smaller pile accrued by those acting as Black participants. So Christian Associates has been involved in the Western Pennsylvania chapter of Bread for the World for years, long predating my participation. And so, but it's funny because although this was created by Bread for the World, I actually found out about it from the United Way of Southwest Pennsylvania. It was leaders at the United Way who found out about it, then knew that I was involved in Bread and called me and said, "Do you Bread for the World people know about this?" And I was like, "No, I don't. Like, let's do this." It's been really interesting. We've led the simulation at a variety of different churches, denominational bodies, community organizations throughout the area. I've led it probably a dozen or so times. There's a group of nonprofit consultants that the United Way works with that have also been sort of bringing it around. They've sort of done more of the secular organization, and I've done more of the religious organizations. I think it's been a really eye-opening tool. There's for me, our interest in doing the simulation, in talking about racial justice in general, and about actually addressing racial justice as an ecumenical body, as a group of people interested in Christian unity, comes in part from our general sense that working together to address important issues in the community can bring us into closer relationship and can strengthen our unity. It's the same reason why we might work on hunger or on disaster relief, right? But with racial justice in particular, there's also this dimension, as the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson actually preached at my installation 10 years ago now. Race is a church dividing issue. People who care about Christian unity, especially in the United States, should care about racism in particular, because racism has divided the church. And so if we want to be about Christian unity, we have to be about the work of racial justice. So there's a couple different reasons why we've taken that work on.
Yeah, your mention of Bread for the World just made me realize that somewhere else our paths crossed. Yep. So, and that actually preceded everything. Bread for the World is a pretty amazing organization. Okay, I always, at this point in the podcast, ask the guest to leave the audience with some words of wisdom.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And not to put you on the spot, I hope you are prepared for this.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can do this.
Right.
So I mentioned, I think at the very beginning, how important the practice of pilgrimage has been to me. And this sense of visiting holy places. And I think I want to leave them with a story. about one of the places that I visited. So in October, I had the amazing opportunity to visit Assisi in Italy on a pilgrimage of United Church of Christ clergywomen, visiting the spaces related to St. Francis of Assisi and his companion, St. Clare of Assisi. Mm-hmm. And there's a story from the life of St. Francis about Francis, who was raised as a sort of wealthy nobleman, a kind of playboy in town, ultimately experiencing the call of God in his life, especially the call to become poor, to give away his belongings and to serve. At first, it was people who had leprosy, people who were sort of not only sick but also isolated. And for Francis, this call in his life came into direct conflict with his father, who was, was a successful businessman and had given his son every opportunity. And what do you mean you're going to throw away all of your this wealth that I've given you? And this whole thing comes to a head. His father brings Francis before the bishop. And so the scene takes place in this courtyard outside the bishop's residence. And there's all these nebby townsfolk around to watch what's happening. And Francis's furious father has dragged his son before the bishop and says, you have to make my son behave. Like, you have to make him stop doing this ridiculous thing that he's been doing and go back to his normal life. And Francis famously takes off all of his clothes. This is not my advice for your listeners. And stands naked in the courtyard, and says, from now on, I have no father but God the Father, renouncing everything in his past. Now, as a person whose religious life I've just summarized, right, there was never a moment in my own religious story where I had to make that choice, where I had to give up everything of my past, where I had to make that kind of sacrifice or, shift from the religion of my family to sort of, find this course. And at first I felt, in hearing this story, I felt a little uncomfortable. But in the art of this story, the bishop stands there and he spreads his cloak open wide, and he comes and he wraps that cloak around Francis and covers him up and sort of claims him for the church. And I realized that maybe is the role in this story that I've been called to play. That I can be the one who stands there with the cloak and is able to cover the people who need the shelter of the church the most. So I think those would be my words for your listeners, is that some of us are called to be like Francis and give up the past in order to seek what God is calling us. And some of us are just called to hold that cloak open as wide as we can.
Yeah. Great story. Thank you so much for that. And before I give our typical closing comments, I need to mention that our previous guest from last week, Leanne Heitzel, is offering 20% off on all her services to listeners to this podcast. And if you go to yourspiritualjourneypodcast.com onto our website, you will see the code to take advantage of her coupon. The other thing that I wanted to mention is you may have noticed that on the back shelves here are a number of books. Many of those books are from the 40 or so authors who have been on this program. Some of the books are just spiritual books that we like to introduce people to. For instance, Oneness and A Course in Miracles. And a new group of books are books from my daughter, who has now published 6 books, two series of 3 books each, and a book of short stories written by my son. So I've decided to display those also. Okay, I want to thank Liddy Barlow, Reverend Liddy Barlow, for being with us today and giving us those great words of wisdom. As usual, Take what resonates with you and incorporate it into your life, and put the rest on a shelf until you're ready to deal with it. And until next time, this has been your spiritual journey.